Hello, everyone. My intercultural communication scholars. This is chapter 8, the culture of capitalism and the business of intercultural communication. As I've explained a couple of times, you need to watch this before going to class on Friday, June 27th. When you go to class on June 27th, we'll simply, after Deborah Sensei takes attendance and all of that, and gets the video set up, then we will have our chapter 8 review that will be done by a team of you scholars. And then after that's finished, then you can depart for what hopefully will be a nice afternoon. But anyway, so this is kind of making up for my normal time when I give you the lecture in class. All right, so the culture of capitalism and the business of intercultural communication. We have a few things that we need to do. First thing I would like to do, though, is share with you this video, kind of a history of capitalism. It's about 10 minutes long, but I think it's very good for what I needed to do. So here we go. And I believe I have the sound shared, so you should be able to hear it and see it.
Today, pretty much every economy in the world is organized along capitalist lines. But at the same time, capitalism is almost everywhere regarded with disappointment, frustration, and suspicion. Interestingly, none of the criticisms are new. They've been dogging capitalism since its inception. So let's look back in time to figure out how capitalism got its bad name and what might be done to improve it. Padua, Italy, 1304. On the wall of a church in Padua near Venice, the painter Giotto makes a fresco, Jesus and the Moneylenders. It restates for his own times an idea that had by then already been well established for centuries in the West. The notion that a good spiritual life and the pursuit of business and money are sworn enemies. Jesus goes to the temple in Jerusalem, sees merchants and small-time bankers crowding the forecourt, and gets furious. This sacred place is not a fitting arena for the polluting activities of buying and selling. The Christian attack on the immorality of money is deeply influential and severely holds back the development of capitalism for centuries. Venice, 1450. A Franciscan friar, Luca Pacioli, publishes the first ever book on accounting, Summa de Arithmetica. It's the single most important capitalist invention until the birth of the joint stock company and the modern factory. In the book, Pacioli introduces the principle of double-entry bookkeeping, which gradually becomes standard practice in all companies. Pacioli's textbook proposes that dealing well with money doesn't depend on fate anymore. Money isn't a divine punishment or reward, it's a kind of science that can be learnt through patience, reason, and hard work. Geneva, 1555. In powerful sermons to his congregations in Geneva, the Protestant theologian John Calvin emphasizes to his Swiss audiences the importance of what have become known as the Protestant virtues: hard work, self-denial, patience, honesty, and duty. These will turn out to be extremely useful qualities for capitalism. Calvin, along with many other preachers who share his outlook, explains that you must never indulge yourself nor spend money having a lavish life. You must simply put any surplus income back into your business as an investment. Calvin adds that being good at business is far more pleasing in the sight of God than being an aristocratic warrior or even a monk. Perhaps more than technology, it's this new mindset that will accelerate the progress of capitalism. 1670, Delft, Dutch Republic. The newly independent Dutch Republic is the world's first explicitly capitalist nation, where lazy aristocrats are looked down upon and hard-working merchants revered. In the churches, Protestant sermons about thrift and hard work are heard. In the arts, outgo glorifications of kings and queens. Johannes Vermeer finishes painting The Lace Maker, a depiction of the intricate, careful and homely tasks of manufacturing lace. In his painting The Little Street, the suggestion is that living peacefully and quietly in your own home, running a business, is far more glamorous and noble than fighting in a war or going to a monastery. 1776, 141 The Strand, London. These are the offices and shop of Strain and Cadell, publishers who have a big success with a new book. An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, written by a Scottish philosopher called Adam Smith. Smith demystifies wealth creation by explaining how capitalist economies grow. He reaches several important conclusions. Slavery is remarkably inefficient. Violence is less of an incentive than money for a worker, and the cost of buying and maintaining slaves far exceeds the cost of wages. Capitalists will make far more money by treating their workers legally and humanely. It's by specializing that economies grow, says Smith. Smith focuses on the pin-making industry and concludes that while one worker could make up to 20 pins a day, a team of 10 workers well arranged could make not 200 but 48,000 pins, thanks to what Smith terms the division of labor. Smith also tells us that capitalism is guided by an invisible hand. By maximizing one's own profit, individuals inadvertently benefit society, providing goods that people want and need. As Smith puts it, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. These ideas further remove the moral suspicion that once surrounds capitalism. But not all will be won over. 1854, London. The British economy is now the largest in the world, thanks to its enormous industries of cotton, shipbuilding, steel and coal. Vast cities have chewed up the countryside of the Midlands and northern England. Merchants and the newly rich capitalist class have triumphed. But many are furious. Charles Dickens, one of Victorian England's most passionate critics of unrestrained capitalism, publishes a novel, Hard Times. Set in the fictional town of Coketown, a version of Manchester, it takes aim at heartless capitalists like Mr. Gradgrind, who abuse their workers, exploit young children in mines and chimneys, and use their relentless capitalist logic to blind them to their desecration of nature and human life. Here is Dickens writing on Coketown. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it, but as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black like the painted face of a savage. Dickens argues that capitalism is evil because it encourages appalling conditions for the producers. Under the sway of capitalist logic, otherwise quite nice people will keep coming up with reasons why it's okay to employ a child in a factory or to let poor people starve once they've reached the end of their working lives. 1860, London. The English reformer John Ruskin publishes Unto This Last, a furious tract against capitalism that takes aim not so much at the production side of capitalism as the area of consumption. Like Dickens, Ruskin is incensed that people are being exploited and the environment ruined, but he asks a further question: in the name of what? Ruskin notes that large capitalist fortunes are built up on selling people absurd things: knickknacks, fancy plates, embroidered napkins, bonnets, carved sideboards. The whole of the suffering of the cotton factories of Manchester are being fed by our appetite for very cheap shirts with delicate collars. We are ruining our lives for trinkets, whereas for Ruskin, money shouldn't only be made morally, it should be spent morally, on the truly noble and beautiful things that humans need. He contrasts the beauty of Venice with the ugliness of modern Britain to make his point. Berlin, 1963. The leader of communist East Germany, Walter Ulbricht, launches an ambitious new scheme, the Neues Ökonomisches System, or NOS. It aims to solve for East Germans the two major failings of capitalism in his eyes. One, it will guarantee workers good conditions, with a huge expansion in the number of state schools, housing blocks and holiday camps. And secondly, it will focus not on the fripperies of capitalist production, like blue jeans and pop music. It will give people the works of Plato and Marx and uplifting television programs about tractor production. 1976, Dresden, East Germany. The fatal flaws of communism come to a head in January with a massive riot about the unavailability of coffee. East Germans love drinking coffee, but a huge rise in global prices means that the German Democratic Republic can no longer afford to import it in the necessary quantities. The Politburo decides to remove all coffee from shops and replaces it with Mischkaffee, mixed coffee, which is 51% coffee and 49% a range of fillers including chicory, rye and sugar beet. Dissatisfaction with this eventually has to be quelled with the use of the Stasi or secret police. It's an inadvertent tribute to capitalism, which is especially good at providing us with life's little luxuries. Edeka hypermarket near Hamburg, November 1989. East Germans who have recently breached the wall head straight for West German supermarkets like Edeka near Hamburg. They marvel at the productive capacities of capitalism and at the ability that it has to provide such modest but very important things as olive oil, party hats, iced buns, and coffee. The old East German elite who had believed that the people could be satisfied with philosophy, athletics, sauerkraut, and TV programs about farming are hounded out of office. 1999, Seattle, USA. The World Trade Organization, a capitalist body dedicated to removing protection from industry and liberalizing markets, gets together for its next round of talks, 10 years since the fall of communism and after a decade of unprecedented economic growth. But though the mood of politicians is upbeat, out in the streets hundreds of thousands of anti-capitalist protesters have gathered to call an end to the iniquities of global capitalism. The complaints are strikingly similar to those made by Jesus Christ. Capitalism doesn't look after the producers, and capitalism downgrades the important spiritual ends of life for the sake of hamburgers, unsustainably cheap clothes, and garish, distracting mass media. With their beards and gaunt figures, many of the protesters look a little like Renaissance renditions of Jesus. The police take a very heavy hand, fire tear gas into the crowds, arrest 2,000, and call in the National Guard. Protests remind the world that besides the winners of capitalism, there is an enormous army of the disenfranchised and the angry, who see more sense in Jesus, Dickens, and Ruskin than in Adam Smith and Bill Clinton. 2015, Cupertino, California. Apple Computers officially becomes the largest corporation in the world. It's a giant success story, but the very same challenges remain. It turns out that Apple are indirectly responsible for the suffering and abuse of workers in the supply chain in China via the Foxconn Corporation. And with the launch of the Apple Watch, a gadget that seems to have no particularly urgent purpose, questions are once again raised about why we're exhausting ourselves and the planet for ends that are so out of proportion with the costs they impose on all of us. To generalize, capitalism is amazingly productive, but it has two big flaws. Firstly, it's systematically inclined to ignore the sufferings of workers unless regularly prodded not to. And the wealth of companies is often built up on satisfying what are not the essential needs of human beings. Fortunes are made on making unhealthy food or bad television programs. The challenge for the future is how we might be able to make money humanely by treating people and the earth well, and also make money through activities which address the more noble end of human needs. Till then, the rage of Jesus in the temple will periodically always go on.
All right. I like that kind of overview of capitalism. Kind of hard to fit a whole history of such a complex topic in 10 minutes, but they did a pretty good job. There are different types of capitalism, though, that we need to acknowledge. We have everything from advanced capitalism, where you have stable economy, high living standards. Maybe that's the ideal. Responsible capitalism, it's where there's a lot of regulation and social welfare programs. We've seen that, for example, in the US and most countries around the world, developed countries, have some sort of a safety net for their citizens, pension systems, unemployment insurance. Sometimes it's healthcare as well, not in the US, unfortunately, as much. But there are systems in there to try to take care of the citizenry, but still utilizing capitalism as kind of the main economic organizer of the country, of the economy. State capitalism, it's mostly a capitalist economy, but there's lots of political control. I mean, the example given there is China, but there are other examples as well. So people are allowed to make money, maybe open companies and things, but the government controls a lot of what you are able to do or say or make even in the state capitalistic environment. Crony capitalism, this is where you might have a monopoly power, where maybe there's a dictator, an oligarch, and there is a capitalistic system, but it's weighted heavily towards kind of the elite, the oligarchs, people who are close to the leader, if it's a dictatorship, that sort of thing. And then turbo capitalism, is where there's simply no regulations, where you can pollute, you can, uh, abuse your workers, you can, not give any attention to health and safety concerns, that sort of thing. So these are some major types. Economists that will probably argue that there are all sorts of nuances even between these and among them. Stakeholder capitalism is kind of interesting. It's a system where instead of just looking towards a company's shareholders, those who have bought stock in the company and making sure that they make money, the shareholders, the stockholders. And a lot of us are stockholders, even if we aren't aware of it, because maybe we have a pension scheme or something. Like, for example, I worked in Arizona for many years as a high school teacher, as an educator there. And I have a pension. I was vested, which means I put enough time in and money into the pension system that the state of Arizona will give me a pension. I think it's when I turn 65, I can start claiming the full pension from the state. Um, and of course, what does the state do with all the money they're collecting along the way? They invest it maybe in companies and the stock market and things such as that to kind of grow the money because they need to kind of keep up with inflation at least. And so, of course, there would be stock holdings in that. So even though I don't directly, in a way, have stock holdings in the pension system, where I can identify it, because I will get the pension. In a way, I'm invested then in the stock market. But anyway, the system, stakeholder capitalism, is oriented not just to serve the interests of the shareholders, people who own stock in the company, but also the stakeholders. Now, who are the stakeholders? They can be the employees of the company, because you are a stakeholder in a company in a way if you're employed there, because you don't want it to necessarily go bankrupt or out of business, because then you would be out of a job. So lots of different formats for capitalism. And there are some successes that we can point to. It's probably the most successful or widely dispersed format for economic organization in the world today. It can be self-regulating in the sense they talk about the invisible hand of the market, where people aren't going to buy your goods unless they want them. People might not be willing to invest in your company unless your company, for example, if people are socially concerned, treats the employees well. So there are all sorts of controls there just based on what people want to buy or how they want to invest their money to control the market. Fits in with human nature. That says something about human nature, but maybe we are kind of acquisitive in a way. And if you look back at even the earliest examples of when we go through and study the remains of ancient humans, we will find that they like to decorate themselves with, wear necklaces and jewelry of sorts. And so I'm assuming there was a desire to acquire these things. And trade and barter and all of that goes so far back, it's prehistoric in a way. So there has been this acquisitiveness in a way for human nature. So maybe that's true. Allows choice and freedom in a way, unless they're monopolies where you don't have any control because all the companies, there are only a couple of companies that sell a product and they kind of control the price and the quality. But generally, it gives choice and freedom. You go to a grocery store, you can choose from like 15, 20 different types of coffee, for example, different types of cheese, different type of this, different type of that. So you do have choice. Capitalists have power to defend interests. All right. So a capitalist, has money, can kind of defend a company, defend a group, defend an investor because of that money. State regulation to reduce the worst problems. So some acknowledgement, yeah, there can be issues, and maybe turbo capitalism is not always the best thing, that there needs to be some control put on the market, on companies, to make sure that they're not abusing their workers, that they're not putting unsafe things into their products. State of technology. capitalism in a way does kind of encourage technological progress because you always want that newest product, right? Look at the tech. I mean, we have new phones coming out every year, new gadgets, all of this. People want more and more availability of technology, and they are willing to purchase it. My wife and I went out to a restaurant last night, and it's changed in a way in such that you have to order everything online. So you get a little QR code there at the table, and then you order things online. I was just thinking, well, what if you had an elderly couple come in who didn't have a smartphone? Because there are a few people out there still who don't have them. I don't know what they would do at that restaurant, but it's just assumed that everybody has a smartphone, that everybody has access to that technology. And indeed, almost everybody does. Almost everybody I know has a smartphone, and we use them all the time. Go back 20 years, they were quite rare. Okay, so people want these things. They want their lives to be easier. They want to have all of the this tech at their fingertips, and so that encourages the development of technology. And it also has the ability to adapt and change depending how the markets might change or what people's needs are perceived to be. Different products will come out, all of that. There are problems, as there would be in any system. There is inequality. People who have access to capital can invest more and probably make more money. Sometimes there's economic instability. Market forces don't always work. There can be supply chain problems. We saw during the pandemic just what can happen from that. Monopoly power, where one company like Standard Oil, for example, might knock out all the competition, then control the market, and then kind of set the conditions on how much you got to pay for oil or for this or for that. Short-termism, where companies tend to think about the next quarter, like how are we going to increase our profits for the next quarter to give our shareholders money. They don't necessarily think, like in terms of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's like yearly. It's like we have a fiscal year, for example, so it's all locked into that sort of thinking. Environmental costs, profit motivations might encourage companies to not pay close attention to what they're doing to the environment long term. And then immobilities, kind of where there are inabilities sometimes because of capitalist concerns to maybe change or have societal change. We see this, for example, in issues of like using fossil fuels versus renewables. Fossil fuel companies don't want to allow their incomes to be damaged, so they invest a lot of money in politicians who will try to quash or discourage investment in renewable energy sources, that sort of thing. And monosophony, where you're just kind of like, you know, one sort of economic system, capitalism, is put in a way on a pedestal, and it's unquestioned, like that's the only system that will work and that's the only system. So the ability to maybe evolve a new system of economic structure is inhibited by this. Nobody wants to take the jump, the chance of maybe losing it all by investing in some sort of other system. And we have incremental changes depending on the markets and the country and the society and even the individuals, for example. But again, seems to be okay, capitalism on a pedestal of sorts, and competing systems or the willingness to allow a system to develop counter to capitalism tends to be discouraged. Now, we saw financial crises in the US. For example, in the pandemic, it was a huge problem. But if we go even further back to the earlier knots, about 2008 or so, we had the financial collapse. There was a house loan, bubble in the U.S. and a lot of unfortunate restrictions that had been put on the banking industry had been removed. Some of it was during the Clinton administration and other administrations going even further back. And unfortunately, this bubble where, you know, housing prices were elevated way beyond what was reasonable. And there became kind of this thing. Well, if you go all the way back, like in the 1600s in Holland, there was a bubble surrounding tulip bulbs, believe it or not, flowers. And there was speculation on different types of tulips, and people were trading tulip bulbs, and they became just this ridiculously overwrought sort of a market on something that was basically ornamental. I mean, you can't eat a tulip. They look pretty. I like flowers, but but it was a bubble. People were starting to trade literally, millions of what would be the equivalent of millions of yen, even billions of yen for tulip bulbs. And then finally, it seemed like somebody said, wait, these are tulips. And that change in mindset was almost overnight. Suddenly everything collapsed, but people lost their whole fortunes. They lost their houses and that because of this. Well, a bubble is where the market kind of becomes overly energetic about a product or a service or something. And when a lot of people want something and there's a limited supply, prices go up. Sometimes not rationally. People who argue, oh, like economics, and it's always a rational thing. No, a lot of it's emotion. People want something that's limited in amount. They start kind of bidding wars on it. And pretty soon a house that you could have bought for, we're talking years ago now, maybe 50,000 US dollars is suddenly selling for $250,000, even though it's the same house on the same property in the same neighborhood. And at some point, the banks were giving loans for these houses to people who, to be honest, didn't have the means to pay back the loan. The banks were kind of banking on the idea that the property itself would continue to appreciate, in this glorious fashion. And, okay, well, fine, if they can't afford the loan, we'll just take the house and the property and it's going to be worth even more. But that didn't happen. What occurred was a lot of people started defaulting on their loans because the banks gave them loans that they couldn't afford to pay back. Banks would then try to collect on the houses, but suddenly the banks were holding on all of this property that's value was dropping. It did not match the amount that they had loaned. Like if I'm a bank and I loan somebody 400,000 US dollars on a house, that person can't pay me back. They maybe pay for a couple of years and they just can't do it. So I take the house and then I say, okay, I'm going to now sell this house and make that money plus whatever I did get from the loan. But then what if nobody buys? Suddenly I don't have money as a bank because I can't resell the house. And if that happens 1,000 times, I'm out of business. And that's what occurred. It's a very simplistic way to explain this. I'm not an economist. I'm a bit of a historian and deal with applied linguistics and intercultural communication, but that's kind of what it is. But anyway, it ultimately led to unemployment, to what we call the Great Recession. And then, okay, so that was one lesson about how sometimes capitalism doesn't work exactly. And then the effects of the pandemic was also something a little more recent that we all lived through. The stock market, it impacted the global economy, disrupted supply chains, disrupted, tourist industries, airlines, everything got impacted because the world basically had to shut down for a while. And some universities, some schools closed because were not able to adapt to the conditions that were necessary. And two, the stock market dropped lower and more precipitously than it had since the 2008 crisis, with the banking and everything else. So all of these systems it showed us just how delicate things were. We talk about markets and we think about them as stable and solid, but it doesn't take much to knock a market off kilter. Let's put it that way. And now, how does this impact intercultural communication. All right. We know that these connections and how economic problems impact different groups of people will be different, often based on sometimes where the individuals are. Like, for example, if you're in the developing world, you might have been hit by this in a greater way, or sometimes a lesser way, depending on how tied in your economy is to the global environment. Like in Bangladesh, with the clothing industries and this kind of fast fashion, they were hit very hard by this because people were not shopping, and therefore stores were not buying, and so they were impacted by this, even though they have a reasonable market at home, but they were kind of geared up to provide the entire world with inexpensive clothing. And so when that occurred, a lot of these companies in Bangladesh had to close. And then, of course, there was people who were unemployed. They had no money, and the local economy started to suffer as well. So we know that if you're in a developed country that has maybe, shall we say, more means of ways to take care of the population, safety nets, and that, you can sometimes weather for a while these sorts of calamities. But if you're in a developing country or in a more marginalized or at-risk population, maybe working class people in the United States in rural environments, for example, let's say you have a factory that had to close in rural Alabama, and that was the only place of real employment, for 50 miles or that around, it would be problematic for you as well. So these sorts of problems, what I want you to understand, impact populations differently. Okay. And even like, for example, when we shut down for the pandemic and suddenly like daycares had to shut down, it became a real challenge for parents, oftentimes for the mothers, especially, or for single parents, especially, to figure out a way to take care of their children and also maybe do work. Now, not everybody had work that they could do from home. If you worked in a factory and the factory shut down temporarily, what are you going to do? Now, in the US, maybe you can get unemployment insurance and you can get money from that to keep yourself alive. But a lot of other countries, they would not have that option. No job means no money. It means starvation, basically. It's that cruel, but that's kind of how it is. And then commodities to culture. If you think about what we have today, I mean, what we need to live, which is, you need food, you need shelter, you need heating, you need cooling. You need the basics of clothing and that and hygiene. But then the rest of it kind of is developed to give us a sense of maybe who we want to be, who we aspire to be, the lifestyles we aspire to. Oftentimes our identities are wrapped up in like what type of clothing we purchase and wear, our needs for entertainment, all of these other things. And then the trade of commodities has brought people and things from different cultures into contact and collision since antiquity. I mean, for example, the Romans loved silk. The Romans, ancient Rome, loved silk. But the thing is, they didn't know how silk was made. They knew it was from the East, but very few Romans had ever even been to China. And in fact, the whole technology of silk production was a state secret, and the Chinese wanted to protect it. So, the Romans got this beautiful cloth that they loved, and it was very, very, very expensive and, luxurious. So only the wealthiest people could wear silk, but they honestly didn't know where it came from or how it was developed. Okay, but they wanted it. So an example of a commodity, silk in this case, traveling halfway around the world to the Roman Empire, so far away that people didn't even know really where silk came from in the sense of how it was created. And yet it was a commodity that people wanted and merchants made tons of money from. And so commodities have been linked to intercultural exchange, right? I mean, I don't know clothing I'm wearing, some of it was probably made in Bangladesh and this and that. But if you think about like your typical day and what you eat and what you use for entertainment and what you watch, music, everything, it's all probably from kind of this around the world sort of thing where trade and that has kind of got you into contact with all sorts of choices you have for clothing, for outfits, for toiletries, for hygiene products, everything else, and we can choose and pick and choose from that, which leads us to intercultural communication needs, right? So capitalism, Michel Biard, and if somebody speaks French and I'm mispronouncing that, apologies, argue that capitalism is a complex social logic that cannot be reduced to economic dimensions alone. In other words, there's a lot of social, cultural, political, and ideological baggage that goes with capitalism. And there are also ethical issues that we need to consider with it. It is, he said, best understood as sets of relationships between those who have the capital, the money, who can invest and build companies and that, the laborers, the people who work for the companies, and then the consumers, the people who buy the products from that company. So this network of relationships becomes very important. And there are roles and behaviors, goals of capitalism. Now, according to Robbins and Doughty, capitalism defines sets of people who, behaving according to a set of learned rules, act as they must act. That sounds like, okay, what? But basically, if you're a laborer, you labor. You go to the company, you get paid normally either salaried, maybe you get a salary, or you get paid per hour. Or sometimes you get paid by the number of products you make each day. And so that's how you behave. You have a relationship with the employer. In exchange for your labor, the employer will give you money, and then you can take that money and purchase what you need for yourself or your family. If you are a capitalist in the sense of owning capital, having a company, being an investor perhaps, then you understand that, okay, I need labor. And so to a reasonable degree, perhaps you have to take care of the labor, at least, follow the rules, social as well as legal regulations in your behavior towards your employees. And then you must show some sort of deference to the consumer. And you need to get the product out there for the consumer to see and hopefully appreciate. And you need to make sure that you're giving the consumer what the consumer actually wants to purchase, right? Development and benefits of capitalism. The culture of capitalism, as we saw from the video, has been developing for hundreds of years, all right, through historical processes. And there have been challenges to capitalism like communism, socialism, and a few others. And even within capitalism, there are different versions, as we discuss. And so all these values in that, as well as the relationships of power between the different groups, like capital owners of company, you had laborers who might belong to a union. For example, consumers might say, hey, we don't want your products, or we're boycotting you because we don't like how you treated your employees or the environment or that. There's power dynamics as well. But it has also provided, probably in many ways, a relative level of comfort for a large number of people. People have been employed, they get money, they can buy their houses, they get to rent apartments, they get reasonable access to food, safety, hygiene, healthcare, all of those things. It's produced a lot. It's been a very dynamic element of economic structuring. But as we did say, there are naturally some problems with it. Now, use value, what does that mean? Use value of commodities in pre-capitalist or non-capitalist societies, and we still have a few, people make or obtain commodities for use. If you think about, if you have a nomadic culture, you kind of create what you need. Maybe you barter for it some things, but usually whatever you need to live, you kind of create on your own for your own family or your use. If you need food, clothing, or shelter, you grow it, you gather it, you go out and get it. And so these commodities have use value. You need them to live. And so you need to have them to sustain yourself. That is use value. Exchange value, though, is if you need something that you cannot make or grow yourself, then you can barter or trade for it. So maybe you have things in your environment, a certain type of berry or a nut or stone or shell that you know that other groups desire. And so you can trade those stones, those shells, those nuts, those that, that whatever it might be to other tribes that have what you want. Okay, a trading culture. Like, for example, in Michigan, where I grew up, you often, relatively often, will find shells out in the forests and places that are actually shells that you could not find except for along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Why are those shells there? Because of trading routes. It went all the way from the Gulf of Mexico up to Michigan, and well, it wasn't Michigan then, but the Great Lakes region and up into what's now Canada. Trading systems, people like these shells. They were colorful, they're beautiful, and so they traded them all the way along the trading routes. And so in Michigan, you can find primarily in areas that might have had a Native American village or that at one time, going back hundreds of years, these shells that have been discarded or left or lost. And they have, they naturally should not be there. They are sea shells in a place that is far, far, far from the sea. And so anyway, that gives you an idea of how the bartering in the system can work. And so that would have exchange value. Those shells had exchange value to the Native Americans who desired them for whatever variety of reasons. Sometimes they used for jewelry. Sometimes they would use it almost as a currency in a way. Now, capitalism and Europe are intertwined, primarily after the 16th century, and economic dominance shifted to Europe primarily. It had different places. It was in China for a while, economically dominant, but it seemed to be moving towards Europe. I mean, it had been in the Middle East for a very long time, and then different parts of North Africa, but then it started to kind of become centered in Europe. And what happened? Well, it kind of spurred colonization, the need for raw materials to feed the industries of Europe. You needed products, you needed wood, you needed exotic woods, maybe, you needed cotton, you needed, products like that. And then they would be formed into finished products in England and what was Germany and these different areas. And then those products would be maybe sent back to the colonies or sold within Europe or other locations. And with that, unfortunately, also came slavery. And we can talk about North America, South America, the slavery. It was an economic decision to go and get exploitable labor. And slavery was a reality. Slavery has always existed in human, as far as we know, in civilizations. There have been elements of slavery of some sort, economic dominance, shall we say, also. But it became an incredibly unfortunate part of the American experience. When I say American experience, I mean South and North America. And especially in the agricultural fields of endeavor, slave labor became what a lot of people considered to be a necessity, but maybe it was a necessity because they refused to see other options. Okay, and this is kind of all part of what we call mercantilism. And mercantilism can be understood as a cycle. You get raw materials from your colony. If you are a colonial power, you get raw materials from your colony. Those raw materials go back to your country, the home country, the colonizer country, and the raw materials get made into finished goods. And then those finished goods will go back to the colony to be sold in the colony. And the colony and the colonials in that colony would not be allowed to trade or buy from any other country other than the home country. So, for example, famously, America, North America, the what became the United States. The colonies were caught in this mercantilist system. So they were told you must sell your products only to Great Britain, and then you must only buy finished products from Great Britain. All right, which meant you didn't have that much control if you're a merchant or a producer of these raw materials of the price that you'd be given or the price you could sell things, right? And so there were a lot of complaints about that, but it was a systematic thing that was kind of supposed to be closed. There was a lot of, illegal importation of goods and illegal trading naturally, but it could be punished, and it was punished. Okay, one of the things that led to the American Revolution was the realities of mercantilism. And then you had trading companies and nation state militaries. The East India Trading Company, the Hudson Bay companies, these were almost like countries in a way. They had their own militaries, they had their militias. They were given carte blanche often, especially East India Trading Company, to literally kind of have their own foreign policy and deal with the colonials in any way they saw fit. Okay, so East India Trading Company, spices, tea, cotton, ultimately a lot of things such as that from India. Hudson Bay Company dealing with furs, trapping, and that sort of thing from what's now Canada. And these intercultural encounters with these trading companies were often relatively negative because there was a huge power balance difference between the company and the colonials, or the people who were there that were providing the raw materials. The company could kind of set whatever price they wanted. You didn't have many choices. There was no competition. And often the companies did not care if they were wiping out local, environmental, well, local environmental issues. Like, for example, the trading companies wanted to deal with like beaver pelts. For some reason, for a while, beaver pelts were very valued and very desired in Europe. Well, there are only so many beavers, little animal, makes dams on that available. And so basically they would be trapped out. You would collect all the animals in a region and literally make them extinct in that area. And that became a problem. We see that also like with rhino horn in North Africa, savannas of Africa, elephant tusks and things such as that, where a population of animal is basically wiped out because of the desire for that product. We don't have, for example, going way back, we don't even have examples. There were lions all the way along the coast of North Africa. And then the Atlas lion was very famous. It was in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. Those animals were all wiped out. Some of them went into the arenas of Rome, for example, over time, and also the pelts were valuable and all of that. So you can see environmental degradation, but the companies don't really care. They'll just move to another product or another area. But the people who originally lived in that area, who were collecting this raw material, they're stuck there usually. They don't have the means necessarily to move to a new area. So, but they're wiped out that local population or whatever the resources were. Mahatma Gandhi and the spinning wheel. I think we all know Mahatma Gandhi, right? So Gandhi understood there was a link among world trade, exploitation, or colonial power, especially, of course, in India at this time. And he used the spinning wheel, which was a locally available tool, as a symbol for independence movement. In fact, the spinning wheel is actually on the Indian flag now. And he recognized that in order to resist the economic hold the British Empire had on India, Indians needed to spin their own cloth instead of buying it from Great Britain, because it was part of a mercantilist system in a way, where the Indians would provide cotton as a raw material, and then the textile industries in England would produce a finished cloth, and then they would sell that back to India. Also, salt became an issue, same kind of thing. And so his famous Salt March, he opposed British taxation on salt, is another illustration of how Gandhi's strategy of nonviolent resistance to the British Empire was based on Indians reclaiming the means of production, cotton, and salt. Just two things, but symbolically, we're motivating the Indians to rebel. And there are new means of capital accumulation. Capital, money, think of that. Of course, the Industrial Revolution in England initiated new means of capital accumulation. Company owners, factory owners could make a great deal of money. And now Wolf, so a thinker would argue that for capitalism to exist, control of the means of production, land, materials, tools, and equipment must be taken from peasants, craftspeople, and workers. So you can't leave the people anything. You've got to take it all under control of the capital, kind of those who control the capital. And then they will organize things through factories or other industrial organizations to produce what is desired as far as sale items. So capitalists control the means of production and the goods that are produced. Laborers who produce the goods must buy what they need from the capitalists. So it's kind of a closed system again, like mercantilism, but not between colonies and colonizer, but between laborer and capital. So therefore, people not only become laborers, but also consumers. There are, famous examples of factory towns in the United States where there was one store where you went to get your food, your clothing, and everything. And it was called the factory store. And you would go there, and the factory would kind of control the pricing of everything. And in fact, sometimes there wouldn't even be money exchange. You would get script from the company that you would then use in the factory. And it was basically a closed system. You couldn't argue against it because there were no other options to get the goods you needed to feed your family or to clothe your family. And so became an issue. It was one famous kind of blues song. I think it was out of the 20s or 30s, but one of the refrains is, "I owe my soul to the factory store." In other words, the guy had this bill at the factory store that he was working hard but could never pay off. And that was kind of part of the idea. You controlled the laborers by controlling their wages and also what they could buy and how much they had to pay for it. So we had the working class kind of forged out of this experiment in industrialization. People who would trade their labor in a factory setting for capital, for money that they needed to then provide for themselves and their families. And back to Robinson Dowdy identified four characteristics of the working class. First, members of the working class must be mobile, allowing them to move unfettered by property ownership to places where the work is needed. So you can't settle. You can't buy a house. You have to keep moving, like migrant laborers in the U.S. who go from, season to season, from crop to crop, from point A to point B in the country, kind of following the needs of the agricultural sector. In the 19th century Europe, the sale of common domain land to large landowners forced the movement of peasants to urban centers because suddenly you didn't have any farmland. So what are you supposed to do? You couldn't be a farmer anymore. You had to go and get some sort of employment in the cities, in the urban environments. Second characteristic of members of the working class is that they are segmented by race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and age. For example, you would have Irish were put against English workers in British factories. You had African American workers against the Irish in the US workforce. And so there was always this conflict between racial groups, ethnic groups that were just trying to survive, basically. But they were pitted against each other by the owners of capital because capital wanted to keep labor prices as low as possible. They wanted to pay as less as they could. And so if you could hire a group of, for example, Italians and pay them all $2 less per week than you had to pay your Irish workers, you would do that. That would foster, kind of an antagonistic attitude between the people from different ethnic groups who are upset that, oh, this group's coming in and getting, they're taking jobs from us for less money. Yeah, that would go out throughout history, basically, in America and other places, whether it be immigrants from like Eastern Europe or from China and that, the US, oftentimes the owners of capital would pit these groups against each other. basically making them bargain for, their wages, and giving the wages to the ones who are willing to accept the least amount of money. And a third characteristic is the working class must be disciplined, at least according to capital, according to ownership. So factories were kind of modeled after prisons, and I could go on and talk about like there was a famous textile shirt factory, basically, in the U.S., turn of the last century, so early 1900s, late 1800s, and it was called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And mostly women were working there. They were sewing. Of course, you had lots of cloth, so lots of flammable, material. And the owners of this factory, which was on an upper floor of a building, would lock the door and lock the workers in during the workday because they were always concerned that people would escaping out, saying they were working, but they were actually out doing something else. So they would lock the doors and then they would leave. And so a fire started one unfortunate day, and the young women, and most of it was young women, could not get out. They were locked in. And so a lot of them ended up, before the flames overtook them, they jumped out the window. And of course, they were going to die from the fall. But what made it even more horrific was there was a fence around that building that had spikes, spikes. So you can imagine dead bodies of young women hanging off of this fence. It shocked people. Now, photography was a thing at that time, by that time. And so, people became aware, and of course, natural sympathy for young women dying horrifically like that. And so it did cause the US government to start stepping in and say, we need health and safety regulations. Certainly, you shouldn't be allowed to lock your employees into a dangerous situation. But they were kind of modeled after prisons, so early factories, watching the workers, making sure they weren't getting out of line. And it was always constant supervision. You'd be given rewards for doing a good job, punishments if you did not do a good job. And so it also kind of tied time into the workday in a way where you were starting to be paid by the amount of time you gave to your employer. This idea of, might have been 12 hours a day at that stage, but you were being paid for your time. Um, it did change the nature of our understanding or appreciation of the way we dealt with time as human beings. I remember this one show, Downton Abbey, I guess it was, about a kind of an aristocratic family. And there was this lady who was kind of the dame of the family, elderly. She was in the Harry Potter movies also. She was one of the head mistresses of the school. But she played this lovely character who was kind of pleasant in a lot of ways. But I remember one scene where, of course, she has never really worked in her life. She had servants and things. And somebody mentioned a weekend, and she looked and she said, What is a weekend?" And because she had never understood time like we do, where, oh, I work Monday through Friday, or if it's the Middle East, maybe you work, Sunday through Thursday or something. This idea that you work for so many days or hours in the week, and then you have 2 days off typically for a weekend. And so if you are aristocratic and you don't actually have to have a job or ever work, then our understanding of time, I guess also, like, people who retire often say that it takes them a while to kind of get used to this idea that they don't need to get up early in the morning and go to work. I mean, it's kind of a shock to their system after 40 years of work, where they have to always pay attention to the clock, and then suddenly you don't need to pay as close attention to the clock. It's liberating, but also takes time to get used to. But our relationship to time changed, I guess, because of this. And often, fourth characteristic is that working class often resisted the conditions that were imposed on them naturally. People want to work in a safe environment. They don't want to. They don't want their children to have to work. They want to have, healthy environments in which to be employed. They want to get an adequate salary. And so this construction of capitalist and labor classes led to the overproduction of goods and economic depressions loom. Because how much do you need? How many refrigerators can you have in your house? How many autos can you have in your garage? At one point, by the way, the Ford Motor Company expected that everyone would change their vehicle, buy a new vehicle every 2 years. For a little while that happened, but then something called the Depression hit, and that ceased to be the model. In fact, I don't know very many people nowadays, even who have means, maybe have some money. I don't think they're buying new cars every 2 years, maybe they hold on to a few more, but it's now we hold on to those big ticket items. So the consumer was born in the sense that companies needed to encourage people to buy their product. And so they needed to somehow or another entice people to buy the product. This is where advertising became so important. And advertising is part of rhetoric in so many ways. And so people were encouraged through advertisement to think that, oh, if they bought this shirt or that dress or that car or this whatever, TV, then your life would be better. Your life would be better. Now, my wife told me a story, and that when she was a child, um, she remembers that one of her neighbors got a TV set. And this was, post-war Japan, and and a lot of people didn't have televisions in their homes. So this family got this TV, and they had it in their home. And my wife went over, and one of the kids in the house there that had the TV was her school friend. So she went there, and then I guess the older sibling was kind of bullying her, saying, "Oh, well, we have a TV, you don't. Oh, we're better than other people in the neighborhood because we have a TV and you don't." And so something like that. But anyway, it was enough to cause my wife a little disquiet. She was very young, in elementary age. And so she went home a little bit teary-eyed and told her father, like, "Oh, well, they have TV and we don't have one," and this and said that. I guess my father-in-law, it's fit his personality very much. He said, "Oh, well, I'm not going to stand for that." So he went out right away, and he didn't care, how much it cost. He bought a TV literally the next day and brought it back to the house and said, "Okay, there, we too have a TV." So, why do you need a TV? He needed it because the neighbors had a TV and he felt they were being mean. And so he's going to show them that they're not the only ones in the neighborhood who can afford that. And so that's kind of how it sometimes works, right? We see other people having something and we say, "Hey, we want that too." And marketers, advertisements are supposed to give us a sense that if we buy something, then our lives in some way will become better, And so that's kind of part of it. The desire for things. We want to consume. I mean, how many pairs of shoes do you need? How many shirts do you need? How many, this, that, the other thing? We have far more than we probably actually physically, or banking or that. There's been efforts on governments, bodies to try to organize and structure the worldwide economy, for better or for worse. We saw in the recent trade wars and things, sometimes things get off kilter. But there generally is an understanding that it's probably better for most societies if there's cooperation in economic areas. Now we have neoliberalism, which is a reassertion of liberal ideologies, advocates reducing state intervention, deregulation. Neoliberalism, we sometimes confuse ourselves because we think of a liberal as somebody who, maybe wants government regulation and that, but traditionally, neoliberalism is the opposite. It wants to remove restrictions on the markets, remove restrictions on companies. Sometimes this can be a little bit dangerous, where maybe health and safety is not going to be paid attention to as much. In other words, the main idea is they want to get wealth into the hands of the capitalists, the people who own capital, who have companies and that, with often the idea that the workers will benefit because as companies succeed, maybe they'll pay their workers more. Doesn't usually happen that way, but that's part of it. And surplus value. Um, the profit that's made by reducing labor costs. So this has caused a lot of companies in the U.S. to decide to move their operations outside of the U.S. If you can go to Mexico, let's say you're in Michigan and you have to pay your workers $17 an hour. If you go to Mexico, you only need to pay your workers $5 an hour. So your labor costs drop. And so those who are capitalists and maybe not tied so much to the local in society will say, okay, I'll go where my labor costs are the least, and so I'll go to Mexico, I'll go to China, I'll go to Southeast Asia, and so this becomes an issue. Then we have the segmented labor force. It's stratified based on various forms of social discrimination. So for example, looking at women, on average, for every US dollar a man earns, a woman is only paid 54 cents, even today. Okay, so that's discriminatory. We could also look at nuances of race and ethnicity and find some disparities there. And so there is discrimination in capitalistic systems based on a whole host of things. For example, the tradition in America for a long time in the 1800s, when education suddenly kind of became something that people were desiring and wanted society to benefit from, early educators, those actually working in the schools, tended to be male, and they were paid not undecently, shall we say, relatively well. And then there was a switch in around 1880 to 1900, 1900, especially in elementary schools, where women were hired. And so the salaries paid dropped because the idea was that the women would only work for a few years until they got married and had kids. And so it was just kind of a temporary thing for them. And a lot of them would be living at home with their parents anyway. So we don't need to pay them much. Same thing happened with secretarial work. A secretary, pre about 1860s, was usually, a distinguished gentleman's or an employer's, right-hand man, basically, male, and would kind of take care of the the senior man's schedule and appointments, and was basically the face of the senior man to the world, the gatekeeper. And then they were well paid, well considered. That's why we call in the US, like we have a Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security. That's because at that time, a secretary was considered to be, an assistant, a very important assistant to the main person, in this case, the president. Well, then when it became like, more women were entering that field, the value given to that job description dropped, as did the pay. So yes, we see these things happen. If women move into a certain field, unfortunately, oftentimes the idea was that the price, they didn't need to pay as much. And often it was social. Women were forced out of employment at different points because maybe they get married, maybe they have children. My mother was a high school teacher, taught mathematics and physical education. She got pregnant a couple of years into the marriage, and she'd been working for a school for a number of years. And when that word got out, she told her friends there at the school, and then word got to the principal, Kojo Sensei. The principal called her in to the office. Oh, Joyce, congratulations. I understand you're pregnant. So when will you be leaving us? See, the expectation was, oh, you're pregnant, you're married, you're pregnant, so you're going to stop working, stay at home, take care of the children. This was in the early 1950s in Michigan. So anyway, culture of capitalism, promotion of individualism and competitiveness, this idea that we're all in competition against each other and the winner will have the most money at the end. So, society is based in competition. Remember, social Darwinism is part of this. Relations and relationships of consumers, that we are a consumer culture. We need more and more and more, and we're encouraged to get more and more and more because of advertisements and just quality of life that we think we need, because we compare to other people. Customers and deliverables. Nowadays, for example, a lot of universities kind of look at themselves on a business model, like, okay, the student is a consumer, and we market our university to the consumer. Like, okay, come to our university and you'll get a job right after you graduate because we're so great here and we got a great name or that. So, universities kind of have to have business models now. They have to have advertised and they have to compete against other educational institutions to survive. And then we have branding, like this university is considered better than that university and all sorts of things. And embedded systems of inequity in a capitalist culture, there's always going to be segmentation and stratification of labor. And people are often viewed, unfortunately, valued based on their income. Like if you make more money, you're valued. If you don't make as much money, you're not. My father had the habit when he would shop for a new car, and he didn't shop for them too often, but he was occasionally. When he would shop for something like that, a new car, he would always wear his oldest jeans and a work shirt and a baseball cap. He would go to the automotive dealer and kind of wander around there. Now, why would he do that? He said, this way nobody bothers me. I mean, people would be polite, like they're not going to say, get off the lot, but they would look and they say, oh, an old guy, the guy doesn't have any much money. Look, he's wearing torn jeans, old work shirt. Um, Maybe he's just a factory worker. Somebody go say hello and see if tell him we'll help him if he has any questions. And then they leave him alone. So he could actually spend time without, this an annoying, auto dealership, salesperson following him around saying, oh, you should buy this, you should buy that. And he just didn't want to bother. So he'd purposely dress down in a way to look poorer than he was. And well, we were middle class, had a farm and he had been a educator for a very long time. I mean, we were never poor in my memory, but this way he would, appear to be impoverished. So people would think, well, he's not gonna buy a new car. He's just kind of wandering around looking at things. So we'll just ignore him. And so he did that. But that shows inequity. People will often judge like, oh, your clothing, you and what type of car you drive and all these things. We make judgments based on that. Humans are valued based on their possessions and their income. Maybe unfortunately, I think. Um, if you go into a profession that doesn't provide much economic resources, maybe that's an issue. I remember talking to a guy who I worked with for a while. He ended up, after he retired, kind of helping to coach football at the high school I worked at in the United States. And he said, listen, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a teacher. I want to be a high school teacher and I want to coach football and this. But he said, my father said, oh, no, you're never going to make any money as a teacher. You got to go into business, make money, make money. And so he did, but he said that I was never really that happy. I was pretty good at my business and I made a lot of money, but he says I get so much more satisfaction out of working with kids now that I retired, as an assistant football coach than I ever did when I was working for this so and so company. So yeah, that's part of it. So forced into like, hey, you got to make money, so give up on your dreams of helping society or doing something you love because of the pursuit of the dollar, or the whatever the currency is. And so in the post-industrial capitalist society, which means we're not really building things so much in the US, for example, or England or other places. We base a lot of our income on services now in the US and other countries in Europe. For example, our identities and worldviews are constructed and branded by corporations. I wear, like maybe you wear Nike shoes, maybe you buy, a certain type of handbag and that. So we identify ourselves, and we do construct identities. Like we have online presences and social media, and people take it very seriously. They want to kind of show off a bit. you know, you um you curate your image on social media. And I do this too. I mean, I don't really use social media a lot other than Facebook because I have, relatives in the US and different parts of the world. So we kind of use it to kind of keep track of each other and see what's going on. But you put up nice pictures, right? and funny things and that. You want to, put a good face to the world. So that's what we do. And oftentimes, unfortunately, I think people look at those and they may not think like that, oh, they're curating this, and they just kind of think everyone's life is better than mine because look, they're on vacation. I haven't had a vacation for 5 years. Oh, look, they bought a new car. I haven't, Anyway, that's sad. That's part of the social media thing. And I think we need to be concerned about that for especially young people who get all wrapped up in this online persona. And then the concept of the citizen in democratic societies is appropriated and conflated with the consumer identities with deep-seated implications for democratic participation. And so the values we often identify, for example, as US culture values, are deeply intertwined with and influenced by the culture of capitalism. I mean, it's just the way it tied together. Pursuit of happiness. It used to be pursuit of, like, I forgot the exact words, but capitalism, the idea that you could pursue a career, you could pursue money, and all of that was kind of wrapped up into the American ethos. And now the intercultural marketplace is the commodification of culture, whether it be through food. You wander around, you see an Indian restaurant, a French restaurant, Italian restaurant, but we kind of commodify our cultures in a way, and even in our entertainment. Like if you talk about K-pop or J-pop or hip hop or that. And so it's packaged in a way that we want to enjoy it. So it might be from a different culture than ours, but we enjoy it. I have a friend, she's really into, she's actually grew up in New Orleans, but she's very much into like Indian movies, the Bollywood movies. So she's really into that. And, she to the point where she's studying Hindi a bit. But it's something she enjoys from a culture completely different from her. And I don't think she's even ever been to India, but it's just what she likes. And so we find people like that, okay? And then cultural practices people will enjoy. Maybe you grew up in Japan and you celebrate Christmas, and you're not Christian, but you celebrate Christmas because you have a tree and go out and get what is it, KFC, this sort of thing. And we do these things, right? And so it's a kind of an intercultural marketplace. We have the options now of enjoying or purchasing things from different cultures, and we do that. And we see culture then as a product, as a package sometimes. And sometimes it can be very direct, where you might have a group of people, maybe indigenous population, that decides that one way to make money for their society, tribe, or what have you, is through tourism. So they make a point of having, like, maybe tours where you can see people dressed in traditional outfits doing traditional crafts and that sort of thing, and they can sell traditional crafts. That's part of it. So culture as a product. And then authenticity becomes an issue then, because sometimes people say, well, once you do that, once you make it a product, then it's no longer authentic. I don't like to get so nuanced with that. I think I understand the idea that people want to maintain their culture, but they also recognize that in today's economy, you need to also make money. And so you can use your culture as a way to entice people to come and see and hopefully appreciate the culture, but also leave some tourist dollars, right? It does, however, lead us to this idea of the other and exoticization of the other. Hard word to pronounce, exoticization of the other, where, okay, let's say I come to Japan for the first time. All right, let's say I'm a tourist coming to Japan. I want to look around and see, hey, why aren't people all in kimonos? I mean, I watched the movie, the TV show Shogun, and everybody was in kimonos. Why aren't they in kimonos? And so maybe, I want to go to Kyoto and I want to experience the whole traditional Japan thing. And it's not how most people might live right now, but that's kind of in my mind. I have this kind of Orientalism view, the predominance, and it's exotic. Americanization of the other, in this case, of the other, of Japanese traditional culture. And same thing could be happen if I go to Thailand, and or I go and maybe if I want to go to the Navajo reservation in Arizona, I wonder why aren't they everyone wearing traditional garb in all of this? And so it also can develop a power dynamic where might look at a culture like a museum piece, like, oh, this is ancient, they're kind of primitive, isn't it interesting? And I kind of might treat it more like a colonizer in a way. There's also appropriation of culture, but sometimes it becomes very difficult to nuance between, okay, is it a culturization? Like if somebody buys like a traditional Chinese dress and they want to wear it to a US prom, and actually this happened, is that culture appropriation? If somebody likes the design of the dress and the mandarin collar and the beautiful silk and they just want to wear it to their American prom, it's a prom dress, or is it appreciation? I'll leave you guys to figure out. I think it's something you got to kind of think about. Just because somebody decides, for example, we have March 17th in the US as St. Patrick's Day. It's also in Ireland, and it's a huge celebration. People who are not Irish by heritage like to get involved, drink Irish beer, and wear green and what have you, and greet each other with some Gaelic that they picked up. And as a person who's actually Irish heritage, I don't mind any of that. I think it's kind of a good fun, and hey, why not? Enjoy the culture. Others might say, no, no, if you're only Irish should be allowed to do that. And anyway, you make up your own mind on that. I think the things are open out there. Sign value. Monetary and sign value is placed on the authentic cultures, cultural forms, and practices. So sign value is a symbolic value of commodities conveying social meaning within the culture and social positioning within the political economy of late capitalism. Okay. And so authentic culture and the other, it's assumed to have existed in the past. So sometimes people say there are no authentic cultures. Everything has been, everybody's running around in baseball caps and jeans now. It's sometimes propelled by nostalgia, but the reality is cultures always change. All right, cultures always change. I teach a course called Epic Origins of Literature. We read Gilgamesh. And what we're actually doing is we're not reading Gilgamesh as it was probably originally. We're reading Gilgamesh as it was put through the prism of the understanding of groups that came to that region later, um, and adopted cuneiform and adopted the language and the culture because they thought it was quite sophisticated. And so they seized on the Gilgamesh epic, and they actually used the Gilgamesh epic as a way to teach their children cuneiform. So that's one reason we have Gilgamesh, because it was so many copies as were made as basically textbooks at the time in history. So, things always are changing. You don't find a culture that's ossified, like they're caught in amber. There's always these, back and forth and changes and influences and things such as that. But again, it goes back to our idea of the primitive, the exotic, and all of these things that we have in our mindset that I think interfere sometimes with true intercultural communication. Cultures influence and change by interactions. Cultures have never existed bounded by space or suspended in time, like I said. So they're always changing, they're always adjusting. And the commodification of culture promotes, rarefies particular constructions of race, culture, gender, class, and sexuality. All right. So, hip hop, powwows, dance hall music, all of that. It also normalizes the relationship to materialism, that more is better, that you should always be purchasing new and the best and the newest products and this, whether it be clothing or, entertainment options or technology. And then we have this idea of economic responsibility and intercultural communication. The United States accounted for 24% of the global consumption of everything. Isn't that kind of amazing? Residents of high-income countries consume more than 80% of the global total, whereas the other 5 million people live on the remaining 20%, for example. Today, more than 1/5 of the world's population lives on the brink of hunger and death. That's quite stark, isn't it? And there are global problems. Global problems are most often framed as economic ones, and solutions are proposed through financial means. All right. So we usually try to deal with any global problem first through economic interventions. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's necessary. Rather than looking at maybe how the structure itself is problematic to our economic system. In the culture of capitalism, a central cultural aspect is the masking of negative consequences. We tend to emphasize the positive. Oh, look, people are elevated out of poverty. Good. But oh, look, we're decimating the environment. Or, oh, look, there's now income inequality that's staggering, and also an oligarchy is kind of seizing power, all sorts of things. Okay, and then I'm just going to show this one little thing on CSR, corporate social responsibility, and then I will let you go.
Businesses have historically operated in pursuit of a single goal: maximizing profit. Yet, over the past several decades, that's changed. Many business leaders have come to recognize they have a responsibility to do what's best, not just for their companies, but for people, the planet, and society. This idea is known as corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and it's led to the emergence of companies that carry socially responsible designations, such as B corporations, social purpose corporations, and low-profit limited liability companies. What corporate social responsibility means varies depending on an organization's goals. At its core, it's a form of self-regulation expressed in initiatives and strategies. Firms are often guided by a concept called the triple bottom line. It dictates that rather than focusing solely on financial performance, businesses should measure their impact on the 3 Ps: profit, people, and the planet. Corporate social responsibility is traditionally broken into 4 categories: environmental, philanthropic, ethical, and economic. Environmental responsibility is the belief that organizations should behave as environmentally friendly as possible. Ethical responsibility is concerned with ensuring companies operate fairly. Philanthropic responsibility refers to businesses' aims to make the world better and improve society. Economic responsibility is the practice of firms rooting financial decisions in a commitment to do good. No matter the type, organizations that embrace corporate social responsibility can reap several benefits. For example, CSR can be a powerful marketing tool that enables companies to position themselves favorably in the eyes of consumers, investors, and regulators. CSR efforts can also improve employee engagement and satisfaction, key measures that drive retention. What's more, it can help attract job candidates with personal convictions that match those of the organizations they apply to. Pursuing CSR also prompts business leaders to examine how they hire and manage, source products and resources, and deliver value to customers. Such reflection can lead to more socially responsible actions, which in turn enables their firms to address the world's most pressing problems while succeeding financially. If you want to understand what it takes to reap the benefits of CSR and combine purpose and profit, explore our online course, Sustainable Business Strategy, and discover how you can become a purpose-driven leader.
All right, I just wanted to share, that's actually from the Harvard Business College. It's a corporate social responsibility. So sometimes I just want to throw that out there that companies are acknowledging, okay, maybe there needs to be more than just profit motive here. Maybe we need to be concerned about the community, society in general, all of that. So there is some effort. And so this CSR is one effort to kind of motivate kind of a more holistic view of the business culture and its responsibilities, as well as benefits of interactions between society and business, and kind of with that. So anyway, thank you, everybody. Remember, you've seen this video. Now you will go to the our lesson on June 27th. And all that will be happening is, but it's very important, is that the team will be doing a review of Chapter 8 with you, and there'll be some discussion questions and all of that. And I want to thank in advance Professor DeBoer for being willing to step in and help facilitate that. I do appreciate it. Okay, everybody, thank you. And I will see you. I will be back in Akita. I'm arriving back from Bangladesh on the 29th of June. So then I will see you on campus after that. All right. Thank you, everyone. Let me stop sharing and let me turn off our recording. Have a good day.